can put it on this one. That's mine.
I'm ready when you're ready.
Whatever works, right? Yeah, exactly. Because Johnny Angus was speaking in the house, and when they had they were talking about the agenda discussion. Yeah. And I was like, oh, anyone who has notes, bring your staff member here instead to talk for you. It's like, just get nervous and they need to have notes. Or I can use my.
Yeah, I don't think this computer is working very well, so I'm going to start anyways.
Yeah.
And then we'll have to. We're going to start, so if people could get to the tables, we'll start with today's presentation.
Yeah.
Welcome to the 6th annual Resources and Sustainable Development in the Arctic project. We had scheduled this morning Stephen Van Dyne, the ADM from INAC, but unfortunately he was informed us that he can't make it this morning. So I will continue with my introduction to the workshop. Comme j'ai dit hier soir, la plupart des présentations, bon, toutes les présentations sont faites en anglais, mais comme j'ai dit hier soir, si vous avez des questions, moi je peux répondre. Il y a plusieurs personnes qui peuvent parler français ici. Il y a Jeanette qui parle français, il y a Ron, Harped, Carney, ma fille Florence qui travaille dehors. Donc, il y a des personnes qui peuvent répondre à des questions en français. Mais malheureusement, les présentations sont faites en anglais. So, if I can start by giving a few technical announcements. The presentations today will be streamed so that our partners in the Arctic can watch our presentations. So if for some reason you do not want your presentation streamed, you don't want to be on the internet, please let us know and we won't film it. For those of you who have people in the Arctic or not here that would like maybe interested in watching the presentations today, on the ReSDA website you can find out where the presentations are being streamed to, and people can you can let your people know that they can watch live the action here at the Royal Elgin in Ottawa. They can also ask questions.
Facebook page.
On Facebook page, the ReSDA Facebook
Yeah.
page, you can ask questions. So if you could let people know. And was there another technical?
Well, it's just that it's not on the website, it's on the Facebook page, the links,
Okay.
and then they go to the YouTube channel.
We have several pages, but
Yeah.
the ReSDA web Facebook page is where
Yeah.
Thanks. So, without further ado, what I thought we would do is I would give you a brief introduction to ReSDA and what we're here to do today. So, first of all, just a bit of background on ReSDA. So ReSDA was a project that the origins are probably around 2008, 2009. As some of you know, many of us were involved in an earlier project dealing with the social economy in northern Canada. And throughout that particular project, a lot of people were noticing that in the north there had been a tremendous increase in interest from companies outside the region in the mineral resources in the Arctic. And while we were having our workshops for what we call the Cernica project, many of the communities started pointing out that, if you guys really wanted to be helpful, you could have research projects on how we could deal with this interest in resource development in the north. And so especially starting in a workshop we had in Calgary in 2009, we started looking at developing a project with our partners that dealt with a very simple question, under the premise that communities now have the ability to say whether or not they want to go ahead with resource development. And so if they have that ability, what's the best possible situation for them? And then based on that, those communities can decide whether they want to go ahead or not with a particular project. So we wanted to provide them with information about what's the best possible results they could get from a resource development project, and that would allow them to make a decision, a more informed decision, hopefully, on whether or not to go ahead with it. So that's the basic idea for ReSDA. We are currently, in terms of our makeup, we're 54 researchers at 29 universities in 9 different countries. More importantly, we have over 30 partners now working with us. We have 4 key partners in our project, but each project also has partners involved, so we have over 30 organizations in northern Canada, plus international partners. Those 30 don't include the international partners we have. We have core funding from the Social Science Humanities Research Council of Canada, and it's under a program that used to exist, it doesn't exist anymore, called the Major Collaborative Research Initiatives project. One of the good things about being under the MCRI project is that now that the MCRI project doesn't exist anymore, we could actually continue, if we wanted to, this project when our project comes to an end by applying for a partnership funding grant to allow us to continue to work. So that's one of the things that we're going to be thinking about in this particular workshop. So we have a very simple research question. We've tried to keep it as simple as possible. What the main focus is how to get a larger share of benefits for resource development in the region with fewer costs. So that's, all the research is based on a very simple idea. It's how do you increase benefits? What's the best situation for northern communities from resource development they can get? And that, as I said, would allow them to make a decision themselves on whether they want to go ahead with the project. We have a main coordination office is at Yukon College, and our main coordinator is Val Walker, Cambridge Bay's best product, Val Walker. Val, as some of you know, was also went to high school in Yellowknife and was the director of the Aurora Research Institute prior to moving to Whitehorse. And we partner, the project is on resource development and sustainability. And right off the bat, we found that we had a problem in terms of dealing with the notion of sustainability because it's such a complex issue. So we started in year 2 to work with a project that is funded by the National Science Foundation in the United States, Arctic Frost, on the notion of sustainability. So we're working more on resource development, and we're leaning more on Arctic Frost to work on the issues of sustainability. And the principal investigator for the Arctic Frost is Andre Petrov. Andre Petrov is here. So we've done I think quite a bit. I had a list of all the things that we did, but I can't find it right now. So we have over 30 reports on our website. We have over 50 refereed publications so far. We have a range of other academic things, but probably most important for us is the knowledge sharing that we've been going through. And we spent a lot of our effort in knowledge sharing. So, for example, we've had over 20 community workshops. We've had 6 community workshops, 6 community workshops that were specifically the entire ReSDA project in the north. But our sub-projects have had individual workshops as well, and so that makes over 20 community workshops in the north. We listened to Zacharias Kanak when we had our workshop in Iqaluit, and he told us the importance of film for knowledge sharing. So we have over 120 videos of researchers talking about their research projects on our YouTube website. And we have a whole range of other projects, which I'll talk about in a second. But in terms of the actual structure of the research, we started out with what were called a series of gap analyses. So these are the 14 gap analyses that we did from the very beginning. And that in 2011, 2012, we completed these gap analyses. And it was based on these gap analyses, which we had decided upon in our first workshop in Yellowknife. These gap analyses were presented in our second workshop in Whitehorse. And at that workshop in Whitehorse, based on these gap analyses, we decided on a suite of 15 sub-projects that we would try to fund on key issues that came out of the gap analysis. And these are the sub-projects that you'll be hearing about today. Some of these we don't have researchers yet, but we're continuing to work on. But the list, and I won't talk about the list because most of these people are presenting today and giving you some of the results of that. As I said, we also worked a lot on our knowledge sharing. We were lucky to get funding to accompany our own funding. We got funding from Canor to develop an atlas so that all of our research findings and all of the findings, or all of the information related to resource development in northern Canada could be placed on this atlas and made available at a click to any of our partners who wanted that information. So we've got the basic structure of that up now. Many of the grad students are here today who worked on this particular project. And we're just fine-tuning it right now. Val, is it open? It is, yeah. We don't have access to it. But we hope to improve it even further as time goes on. And in addition, as you noticed on our website, we have all of our research reports have plain language summaries. They're in English right now, but we hope to translate them into several Indigenous languages and French at some point. And these are plain language summaries. We're lucky to have Jessica Dutton from the Aurora Research Institute. Jessica, where are you? Back there. Jessica working to translate some of the more incomprehensible language from our researchers into something that people in the communities can actually understand. So we have plain language summary as part of our work. So, what are we here for today? So, as I was trying to sort of to hint at, is that each of our workshops are based on some sort of objective or some sort of theme. When we had our first workshop in Yellowknife, we wanted to set out sort of the gap analyses that we would look at to make sure that we covered all the main questions that people were interested in. In Whitehorse, we analyzed those gap analyses to try and develop what projects we'd be looking at. Those projects were started shortly after Whitehorse in 2012. 2013 was devoted to knowledge sharing, as I said. We wanted to find out, before we even started to deliver the research results, what were the best ways of getting those research results into people. We didn't want to produce a series of research reports, as Mary Ellen Thomas always reminds us, that just sit on shelves and gather dust. And so in 2013, we had a very interesting knowledge-sharing-based network in Calgary, where we talked about a whole range of knowledge-sharing techniques. And we're actually in the process of creating a book, which will be hopefully published soon by Nunavik Arctic College Press, based on the knowledge-sharing information that we first talked about in that particular workshop. Then we were in Happy Valley Goose Bay in 2014. We talked about well-being. The ideas that resource development had to ensure, first of all, what the well-being of these communities was going to be beneficial to those communities. So we had a very interesting discussion in Happy Valley Goose Bay, Labrador, on well-being. And then in 2015, on the anniversary of the signing of the James Bay and Northern Quebec Agreement, we had a workshop devoted to land claims and subsistence activities in Kuchwa, 2015. But today, we had from the beginning decided that at least one of our workshops would be in the South, and that workshop in the South would be based on the idea of translating our research results into policy useful things. A lot of us are researchers that are perhaps good at doing research. We may not be so good at getting the results of these research to the people who make policy decisions and who develop policy. So that's the objective of this particular workshop. We want to take our research results and find out the best ways of translating these research results into something that can affect research policy. So as a result, there are three. The workshop is really divided into three different questions, and almost chronologically, is that on the first day today, we're going to be basically talking about the results. What are the results of our research up till now? Some of the research projects are finished, some of the research projects are in midstream, some of the research projects have just been started, and so we'll have a range of presentations based on the timing of those particular research projects. But then afterwards, and then on Friday morning, we'll be talking about our research partners, that we have been working with other research projects both in Canada and internationally, and that's what we'll be talking about on Friday morning. And Friday afternoon will be a discussion of how do we as researchers translate this information into policy relevant. And so that's Friday afternoon. And then at the end, the questions that if we have time for is we'll try and talk a bit about where do we go from now? What do we do with this? What do we have a network established? What do people want to do with this network and future research? So with that, I will have the first people.
You can just plug it right in. Do you have an adapter? Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everyone. The first session of the day, everybody's had their coffee and they're ready to go and learn a lot about a whole set of different research projects that have been underway. The focus of this first session is on well-being and resource development, and I'm very honored and pleased to have numerous colleagues going to present in this session. Firstly is my friend Jeanette Lockhart and Michelle. These two colleagues from Contaminated First Nation will be talking about some of their work in the community of notably a project on well-being and community health monitoring that has been going on since the mid-1990s. But their presentation is going to be more methods focused, talking about the work that they're doing, a lot of the research around well-being and community-based monitoring. There's a little bit of an absence of conversation as to what happens to the data. So their work, they're going to talk a little bit about the archiving, organizing, and interpreting, and use of that knowledge in the community. The second project is the Environmental Legacies project, and Ann Dance, our colleague from Memorial University, will be speaking to that project. Asbestos Hill is another key issue that many of you may be aware of. Jeanette is going to be speaking about that project and Inuit Expereinces with Nunavik's first mine. Very diverse set of presentations for it. Mr. Kent Spiers, soon to be Dr. Kent Spiers, will be also talking about different ways of measuring well-being in the Arctic. Some work he did with Chris Southcott during his master's but he's gone on to do his PhD in Calgary, so another colleague from Alberta. And finally, Todd Godfrey, one of our students from the University of Alberta. He's been working with the Indiana Regional Corporation, looking at different kinds of data they have or are interested in accessing in order to undertake their own sustainability monitoring work in that region. Now, I'm going to pull up Jeanette and Lorraine's slides here. We're having some technical challenges. I guess I should say my name is Brenda Parlee. Usually people start with that. I'm one of the theme coordinators for ReSDA. I'm based at the University of Alberta in the Department of Resource Economics and Environmental Sociology. I've been working in the Northwest Territories mainly, but through ReSDA and other networks and various parts of the North for the last 20 years. And this first presentation is an important one for me because I've been working with Jeanette, especially for many, many years. So it's a real honor to have her here. So Jeanette and Lorraine, I'll pass it over. This is where you can have to present against the numbers. So I'll just pull up the Oh, let me introduce yourself. Yeah, about 10 minutes, so I can jump in whenever. Morning. My name is Jeanette Lockhart from Lutsel. Hi, I'm Lorraine. Okay, I'm not sure exactly how to start. So we've been dealing with the oil traditional knowledge from back home and collecting information through a couple of universities and back home. Liquid from Lutsel, which is on the east arm of the Lutsel Lake, and then we have like tons of granules from waste impacting the family industry, and we wanted a way to preserve our traditional knowledge. It's always been like from storytelling, isn't really documented. It's one of the little pictures of like summertime, celebrating and local fish. And we wanted to it's somewhere really special to us, especially in the fall and the springtime. Like that's when we harvest our caribou. And it's kind of been really tough for us for a year now because there hasn't been caribou market. It's really tough for us. But, we have a camp up in Carney River. Brenda's been up there with a couple of university students. And that was lots of fun. So like the chief and council help guide the research and governance for research development. So it's kind of like help researchers get their research started. We work for our band. It's in a First Nation group. It's called the Wildlife and Environment Department. I'm working with Framework System right now, which you rely on the GIS software that you don't know what's going on technical and stuff. And this growth market makes it a bit more accessible, more easier to search. But here are some of the projects that we've been working on since the 90s. Oh, yeah, I have like, some transcripts here, but I don't think I'm going to read it because it's kind of long. Like the TUNED that are Law 2 is the Nunavik Lake project. It's basically about the hydro dam. They want to go to corporate because they want to expand it, but that's where we used to travel. We used to like go hunting, and the dam actually flooded Nunavik Lake, which they have graveyards there. Like old people said there used to be a graveyard there. Now it's just like full of water, so now they can't find the grave sites, which the elders and like they're kind of upset about that. So stuff like that, and all these projects here, that's the ones that I am putting into Trailmark, which is keeping it all organized. So just to jump in, there's 2 or 3 slides here. One of the projects that Laura Jane has been working on is integrating data from a community wellbeing survey that was started in the 1990s. So the first survey was in 1996. This is 2016. So the survey initially was developed based on indicators identified by the community. So well-being has different needs in different socio-cultural contexts. What matters to Lutsel doesn't necessarily matter to the territorial government. What matters to people in Nunavik doesn't necessarily mean the same thing in Lutsel. So this local set of indicators was the basis of the survey. So going on 20 years now of data collection using the same indicators, and so I think it's one of the oldest community-based monitoring initiatives looking at the socio-economic impacts of mining. The first set of surveys were done just as the BHP diamond mine was approved, and now we're sort of into the closure phase of some of these diamond mines. So we have construction, operation, closure, and the data from the community and that whole life cycle up and running. So some of you know about that project already. Looks a little bit different than the kind of data being collected by government, the territorial government, which typically is a little bit more negative or more of the local pathologies or concerns about crime and social problems in the community, kinds of indicators that Lutsel is using in their survey are quite a bit more positive and capacity oriented. So it really frames the community through a different light, or focusing on positive, not just negative stereotypes we often see in media. That are monitors used in the summertime. We have a monitoring group called Nunavik, which is watchers of the land. This Trailmark system tablet, they take it with them. There's surveys on there, which is telling about fish, samples in the water. And then we have a winter monitoring program, which is called Nunavik, with my uncle. He works for a bunch of food mine, watching the animals. It's pretty good because it tracks where you go. You do pictures on there, and it just shows you. What you're seeing here was developed
70s and 80s, and we were able to retrieve this back from them. And I sort of through the GIS files, and this is what we came up. This is one Alberta casualty, and this is his top line throughout his lifetime. You can see where he traveled all the way to Smith, all the way up to pretty much where the mines are currently located. Yeah, so I'm pretty excited about this because it was always just like you said, shelved away, and we were able to take it back to the regional level and bring it to our communities. Some of our chief and council haven't really seen this since they were like teenagers. Why is this work important? Because the elders preserve it for the younger generation so that they will understand the culture and the livelihood. We want to preserve it for the school, so the school kids nowadays, they're like more technical and all computer, and so this is a great way to share these sort of oral history. And it also helps our negotiation team because, like you said, some of the stuff that we've heard about is not really documented, but it is currently used. That helps with our national, trying to develop a national parliament. Like you said, like the day in Lutsel, because they're trying to expand it. Why is it important? Because it's important to our future. My background growing up, my parents, they're out on the land people, so I'm like really connected with the land. I really love it. I really like how they taught me growing up on the land. I have a daughter, and that's how I want to teach her too, right? Like how we grew up, like our culture. I want to still keep it strong. And I hope that we have more programs like down the road for our kids, because we're kind of losing our language and losing a lot of things, because nowadays it's so modern. So I hope we still connected with our land and our culture and what the elders taught us. Just wants me to say how our elders say our kids' kids is says Ken as Ken, like our kids' kids. Great, so they got the first presentation, it's out of the way now. Thank you. Does anybody have any questions for
I think we'll do the questions.
Oh, we're having questions at the end. Good job, guys. Thank you very much for the presentation. The little slide about this particular presentation, it's also important to note that we're doing other research with other demographics around what is well-being in the north. We have a PhD student, Cynthia Amati, who's originally from Kenya, working with new Canadians, land immigrants, and transient workers in temporary workers in Whitehorse and Yellowknife, and did a series of interviews, and so that work has been published in Northern Review. And so those of you interested in that perspective on well-being, you can have a look at that presentation. So next I'd like to introduce our colleague Anne Dance from Memorial University. And Anne, I'm not sure which presentation. Absolutely. Okay.
They didn't give us any controls. I mean, I'll try to contact them.
So can everybody hear me? I need to speak with notes, so I can't follow you guys, which it was really, really interesting, but if I speak without notes, my mind goes completely blank, so I'm going to go with my notes. So thanks, Brenda, for that introduction. Thank you to Chris, and especially to Val for organizing this conference. And I really want to thank Val especially, who's been so supportive and helpful through the years of my postdoc. So I'm actually now a researcher at the University of Ottawa, a visiting researcher, but I did a postdoc with John Samos and Arnie Keeling, who helped me do this postdoctoral research. So I'm going to talk about that today. And I also want to thank ReSDA for funding my postdoc. And I apologize, I have to disappear. I committed last winter to a conference in Edmonton this weekend, so I'm actually flying to Edmonton in a few hours, but I'm really accessible by email, by phone, and Arnie Keeling will be here later today, so he'll sort of be able to carry on talking about this particular research. Yeah, so please do contact me. I'm very contactable. So that sounds contagious. As a postdoc, I conducted research related to environmental legacies, resource development, and remediation in the Arctic. I was specifically interested in abandoned mines, so I'm an historian. I used historical sources and contemporary policy documents, hearing transcripts and interviews with key informants to understand this topic, and in particular to understand the evolution of northern mine remediation policy and the current challenges facing communities living near operating and abandoned mines. So there are two phases of this research. First, understand the state of current policy and practice, and then secondly, figure out how we got here by tracing the emergence of federal, provincial, and territorial programs, what they accomplished. So this is very much a macro study, and what you'll be hearing next is a study of a particular site, and I think they complement one another. And I just want to talk a bit about why I took this particular approach. As a Southern settler academic, I didn't want to speak for Northerners, but I do have a background in remediation policy, and I have a lot of experience in that area based on my PhD research, so I thought that would be the most useful way I could contribute to this conversation. And that it is, I did do this in response to a lot of concerns. The policy is confusing. I've spent a lot of time with it. It still confuses me. So I wanted to help untangle that so that when people say, well, we're confused by this, and what are the policies? There was some sort of baseline for understanding them. People who work in the field understand them, but they work in the field, and so they spend a lot of time with it. So I'm going to keep it short, but I did do the Northern Review article, so it's accessible through that. And sorry, I actually jumped ahead. So there's the Northern Review article, and there's also the poster I did to complement this work. So in terms of the problem, I wanted to understand how these programs were created. So I started earlier in the 20th century, but in 1954, I think this is notable. When reviewing the criminal code, an opposition MP raised concerns about mine cleanup with the Justice Minister and received a rather lackadaisical reply. And well into the 1980s, mine site cleanup was frequently characterized as a basic, one-time only process. After a mine closed, operators simply had to remove existing debris, resurface the area with clean soils, and plant some grass, maybe. Obviously, this didn't necessarily work well in the north. For much of the 20th century, the assumption was that so long as a few simple remediation steps were taken, reclamation engineers and government regulators could move on. Remediation was a component of closure, but closure was largely contingent upon mine operators fulfilling the polluter pays principle. So you pollute the land, you reclaim the land. And again, these are standards and expectations for southern places. In the north, remediation practice for much of the 20th century was even more limited. So what changed? In the south, it's a whole other context. There are all these industrial brownfields that have to be reclaimed, a lot of development. In the north, large-scale mine bankruptcies during the 1990s and 80s due to plunging commodity prices, forced the Canadian government to actively pursue funding and mitigation strategies for newly abandoned orphans, so-called orphan mines. So essentially, companies had left the sites without carrying out any remediation works or depositing sufficient securities, or any securities in some cases, for others to carry out remediation. So this left the federal government liable. The federal government was also liable for other types of contaminated sites. Ongoing complaints stretched way back. Indigenous communities were actively concerned about the absence of remediation or the quality of remediation. For example, people complained tailings weren't covered, and obviously this is a problem, and they expressed their frustration. In Nunavik, also, hunters found dead and dying animals near unremediated mine exploration sites in the 1980s and 1990s, and they communicated their frustration. And I think it's worth stressing that northern communities made powerful and persistent arguments about the need for swift and effective reclamation measures that met their standards, and this is consistent, it's not a new thing. So meanwhile, something strange happens in Ottawa. So during the 1990s, the Federal Auditor General, like many of the strange things that happen in Ottawa, the Federal Auditor General took up the cause of abandoned mines. So why is this suddenly a cause for the Auditor General? Because they were a multi-billion-dollar liability, and they weren't properly included in the federal books. So in the late 1990s, the federal government's accounting standards changed. So accountants are the heroes in this story, and remediating abandoned old mine sites on federal land actually now helps pay down the deficit. So it's considered sort of a popular government measure because it contributes to paying down the deficit, which in the 1990s was a big initiative. So it's a push from northern communities. We want remediation, but it's also changes down south. So what are the new programs? And so essentially people recognize that there are all these contaminated sites across Canada. These are the ones primarily on federal or crown lands. And there are these new programs that exist. I don't have time to get into them all, but it's worth noting that contaminated sites remediation programs up to the 1990s were often designed for southern brownfields, not northern places. Techniques were often oriented around agriculture, and this led to a lot of problems. For example, I can't get into them all, but at one point, reclamation in the Yukon introduced foreign weed seed, invasive species. There was very little consideration or capacity to consider wildlife issues, which obviously are extremely important when you're looking at remediation. I think it's also worth noting that if you look at these policies and also specific measures, remediation has become tied to key federal policy priorities. So it's now portrayed as an investment in research and development and industry in northern communities, and as an opportunity, perhaps even a staple of new northern economies. And Faro is a great example of that. Also, I think it's worth noting that remediation experiences, or the lack of remediation, has shaped how northern communities and governments think about and assess the costs and benefits of natural resource extraction and territorial authority over lands and waters. So how we reclaim these sites has now become a component of how we negotiate land claims agreements, IBAs. People care about it, and it's there for sure. I also want to highlight the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan. A lot of you were here yesterday for the Giant Mine film, and that project is being funded out of the pot of money that is the Federal Contaminated Sites Action Plan. So essentially, it allocates funds to existing programs. So this is what it looks like now, although this actually has to be updated. This is a few months out of date. So there are many programs, policies, and laws affecting contemporary remediation, and I created this two-pager just so if you're interested in the policies, as a community member, as just an interested citizen, you can go, and it's all hyperlinked, so you can go and actually read the policy or the program. And I think it's worth noting that there are different programs for different types of mines, for different sites, for different jurisdictions, so there's no overarching vision informing planning. And sometimes that makes sense, because every mine is different, every community is different. I also want to emphasize that local interventions consistently shifted federal approaches to northern remediation. Expectations for site cleanup are now more substantive, and in fact, the definition of reclamation has changed. Operators must submit plans from the mine's cradle to grave. Mining and other operators are responsible for consulting with communities and developing intricate, decades-long remediation plans long before extraction begins. Remediation efforts draw on traditional knowledge and encourage local involvement, although not necessarily consent. So what I'd argue from this study is that effective reclamation demands much more than one particular technological fix or planning strategy. And this is something we got to, I think, in the conversation last evening, somebody raised this point. So what each community needs and asks for consistently is a candid discussion of the goals and limitations of reclamation projects and the minds that create the need for reclamation. And this is the big crux of the issue. Large-scale reclamation is still frequently portrayed as a challenging technological feat to be resolved by studies, by checklists, by classification systems, and by specific funding allocations. These systems are not always accessible or transparent for anyone but a trained scientist. And this, for example, is the giant mine in the federal contaminated sites inventory. So it's not the most accessible program. It's great that the information is there. It's fantastic. It's transparent. But it is not always easy to understand. Reclamation can also divorce cleanup from the extractive activities that created the need for remediation in the first place. And federal programs also struggle to confront the daunting temporal dimensions of reclamation. For example, maintenance and monitoring contaminants in perpetuity, forever. So we heard about giant mine yesterday, but there are many other challenges that are not necessarily comparable. They're different, but they're still major challenges facing communities and facing people living in the mines. So I think the temporal dimensions are very interesting. The oft-repeated rationale for these programs emphasizes a particular conceptualization of Canadian history, and I'm a historian, I'm interested in this. The narrative describes an older era of irresponsible, polluting, and unreclaimed mines versus a new era of responsibility and stewardship. But this narrative doesn't always reflect northern experiences. And so this is the definition of EXPA, which I can never pronounce properly. Too many acronyms in this project. But it does sort of promote this perspective, and in fact, it only covers mines up to a certain point. And the problem is that mines are still being abandoned. So there's this gap here. And I think it's worth noting that the North needs stable long-term funding to address mine reclamation as a component of wider cumulative effects and development. So mine remediation fits within all these broader challenges. And I think there's more recognition of that. I think there's still some way to go. In particular, much more must be done to address the temporal dimensions of reclamation. And the big takeaway, remediation is often defined differently depending on the audience and the speaker. So similar to the presentation we just heard, definitions matter. Who makes the definition really, really matters. More must be understood to understand how communities define and understand remediation and ensure that these ideas are incorporated into reclamation planning and policy at every level. And I think from a researcher perspective, what we need is more place-based studies. And that's what Jeanette's going to talk about. So I'll turn it over to her. Thank you.
So our next speaker is going to be talking about one particular mine and Inuit experiences of a mine in Nunavik. And let me just see if I can find your presentation, Jeanette. They're all called ReSDA presentations.
Good morning, everyone. So my name is Jeanette Carney, and I just graduated 2 weeks ago from a master's in geography from Royal University of Newfoundland. So I'm now a Master of Geography. And very good. My project was on the Asbestos Hill mine in northern Quebec, Nunavik. So up in northern Quebec, there's this hidden mine that no one really talks about, and it's not really well known. And although it's been mainly forgotten today because of a lot of other mining that's been happening in the area, it has a lot of important information on fly-in, fly-out operations in Canada, and also on experiences of Inuit with asbestos mining in Quebec. So before I go into my specific mine, I'm going to talk a bit about the context. So there were a lot of social changes that were occurring in the 1950s and 1960s, and a lot more federal involvement in the Arctic. At the same time, after the Second World War, there was a big boom in mineral exploration in the Arctic. So there were a lot of changes happening before these mines came. And then what the literature talks about with mining in the Arctic is that mine operation has a really big impact on these communities. It brings a lot of jobs, and it changes Inuit lifestyles and Indigenous lifestyles. And then what we see is that when the mine leaves, so one example is the Rankin nickel mine in Nunavik, is that when the mine leaves, people have moved into these settlements, they've gotten this wage labor, and then when they lose all their jobs, it has a really devastating effect on populations. And then finally, from what we saw in the movie last night, Giant Mine, is that when these mines have really devastating kind of legacies, and they have this kind of like zombie mine effect where they can affect people forever, pretty much. Okay, so my specific mine, the Asbestos Hill mine, ran from 1972 to 1984. It's an asbestos mine in northern Quebec between the two communities of Sedwick and Kangersuuak, so where that arrow is. It's the first mine in Nunavik and the second mine in the Arctic. And it was actually the first fly-in, fly-out operation in Canada, which is kind of interesting. So this is the community of Sedwick, and this is the community of Kangersuuak. When the mine was operating, Sedwick had a population of around 400 Inuit, and then Kangersuuak had around 200 people living there. So my research questions, the first one was focusing on the history of the Asbestos Hill mine, because this is the first research to be conducted on this mine. So I wanted to understand the operational history, and then I also wanted to research the experiences of Inuit working at the mine, and then finally look at the impacts and legacies of this mine. And to do this, I went on, my methodology was based on oral history, so interviews, and also on archival research. And so between May and July 2015, I went up to Sedwick and Kangersuuak and interviewed 17 participants. And most of them were former Inuit Asbestos Hill mine workers, but I also tried to interview some women and also community members to get a more well-rounded experience of the mine. And then I also traveled to the Archives Nationales du Québec, which is the National Archives, or the Provincial Archives in Quebec, and I did some research at the Habitat Cultural Institute and the National Archives of Canada. And what I found was that there was pretty much absolutely no information on the mine whatsoever, and there were no company records at all. And so this was a really big problem, and it's a gap that I think really needs to be addressed in the future. Okay, so my results. For the mine operation, it was a fly-in, fly-out mine. It was really different than how we do fly-in, fly-out right now. People would work for 3 months at a time, often working actually as far as 9 months, and then had a 2-week vacation. So southern workers would come up from a flight from Montreal, and a lot of the management were Anglophones, and then the laborers were mainly southern Quebecers from the Thetford Mines asbestos mining region. So they would fly up for these 3 months, and then Inuit would come either by Peterhead boat or by skidoo in the wintertime. And the mine operated for 10 months out of the year because it's pretty rough to mine in the Arctic in the winter. And even with this 10 months of operation, they produced about 1.5 million tons of asbestos fiber per year. Okay, so this is a photo of the mine itself, and then this is the storage facility at Deception Bay, which at one point was actually on the Guinness World Record for the biggest storage facility in the world. And so what they would do is they would mine this asbestos year-round, or not year-round. They would mine the asbestos, and then they would bring it to the Deception Bay storage facility, store it there until they could get it on a ship to the manufacturing production plant in Nordenham, Germany. So this was kind of an international affair. And so comparing this to the average asbestos mine in southern Quebec, which produced about 900,000 tons of asbestos per year, the Asbestos Hill mine was a pretty good asbestos producing mine. So the second portion was about Inuit work experience. And so what I found was that Inuit were recruited by federal government officials and also by friends and family who were working at the mine or who had been involved with the construction. They mainly started as laborers, and then they would move up and gain the skills to be heavy equipment operators, mechanics, electrician helpers, or dynamite boys, which is a very scary job, it sounds like. But overall, what surprised me from my research was that these Inuit asbestos mine workers had a very positive work experience. Not a single person told me that they regretted working at the mine. And so they actually described it as kind of a Wild West kind of experience where, actually I might have a quote. Yes. Okay. So one of my interviewees described Asbestos Hill as, at the Asbestos Hill mine, there was a bar, and even if that bar had closed, there was all the time alcohol, gambling, and some prostitution. They used to send prostitutes to the mine to keep those mines up and running. So when I was interviewing people, I found that a lot of people talked about the Italian mafia in Montreal and saying that it was involved either with the operation and with the construction of the mine, bringing drugs and alcohol into the community. And then I have a photo of the mine, or of the bar at the mine. So there's alcohol and or beer and wine being sold at the mine. So the impacts and legacies of the mine. The mine closure, when the mine closed, it was mainly owned by the government of Quebec, who had bought up most of the shares of the mine company, which was the Société Asbestos Unité. And so when they closed the mine, it didn't really have a big effect on the population right away, the closure itself, because not too many people were really deployed at the mine. There were only about 10 to 40 Inuit working at the mine at one time. So that part didn't have a big effect. When they shut it down, they pretty much just did a really rough cleanup. Like Anne mentioned in her presentation, there weren't a lot of regulations at the time for reclamation or remediation. And so there wasn't very much that was done. And it closed in 1984. And so for the health and social impacts, so one of the biggest impacts they found was that the mine brought up a lot of drugs and alcohol, which then stayed in the communities and has really been a problem in the Expereinces ever since. And so one person said, just prior to the closing of the mine, it was an open season for getting some cheap booze, and that really affected Sedui. For a small community, it has a big impact on everyone. It affected families quite dramatically. And so drugs and alcohol has a big impact. The other health impact was asbestos mining. We all know now that asbestos has a really big impact on people's health. And so this is something that's very hard to tie at this point because it's already been about, over 30 years that the mine's been closed. And so it's hard to make this link. But when I was interviewing people, there are a lot of stories of previous Inuit Asbestos Hill mine workers who had died of some cancer or had some health impacts. And so they really tie these health problems with the mine and the asbestos. In terms of the cultural impacts, this was the first real big introduction to wage labor in the area. it kind of solidified the move from kind of nomadic subsistence life to now semi-subsistence lifestyle where you would hunt mainly on the weekends and then work during the week. And economic didn't really have a very large impact because the only money they were really seeing was through, really small portion of employment. The other big impact was environmental. So this is a picture of the Asbestos Hill mine tailings 30 years after the mine closure. And I've been told that it's really tall. It looks small in the picture, but it's very, very big. And so when the mine shut down in 1984, there was a little cleanup. And then 10 years later, in 1994, the government of Quebec made a deal with Falconbridge, which was the owner of the Raglan mine at the time. And they sold them all of the Port of Deception Bay, the storage facility, and all these things in exchange for a cleanup. So the government of Quebec gave this big plan for the cleanup, and Falconbridge didn't clean up until 2001, and then it stopped without completing the cleanup fully. So now, today, the government of Quebec is still sending many well-worded, kind of angry letters to the Raglan company and also to the company at Asbestos Hill, trying to get them to finish the cleanup because they still have to deal with there's a lot of oil, there's a lot of contaminated soil, and there's also, they need to fix these tailings over here. So conclusions and implications. Overall, the work experience at the mine was really positive, but the community experiences with this mine were very, very negative, with the introduction of drugs and alcohol, and pretty much seeing a lot of negative effects and not seeing very many positive ones. And because of this negative community experience with the mine, it helped lead to the first impact and benefit agreement between a mining company and a First Nations or Indigenous group in Canada, which is the Raglan Impact and Benefit Agreement. And what people told me was that they had such a bad experience as a community with the Asbestos Hill mine that they wanted to make sure that this never happened again. And so they made sure to talk to the mining company and to have a long-term plan and more positive effects. So it really changed mining policies in Nunavik and actually the rest of Canada, because now it's just expected that we do an impact and benefit agreement. And so this research contributes to the knowledge of Inuit experiences with mining and a bit on fly-in, fly-out operations.
Okay, thank you so much, Jeanette. And our next speaker is Kent Spiers. Kent, I suspect your presentation is also part of
being president. Good morning, everybody. My name is Kent Spiers. I'm currently a PhD candidate at the University of Calgary, and I also work as a research assistant at the Arctic Institute of North America. And I just want to say that it's really great to be here at my first ReSDA meeting to hear about the research that's been going on, and it's going to continue to go on, and to actually finally get to meet some of you. So, as Brenda is bringing up my presentation, I'll just sort of get started. The title of my master's thesis is Northern Exposure and Comparison Study of Alaska and Yukon Models of Measuring Community Wellbeing. The last time I presented this, I had a young gentleman come up to me at a conference and say, "I'm really excited about your talk on contaminants." It had nothing to do with contaminants, but maybe I should have thought of it differently. But, yeah, that's it. Thank you, Chris. Okay, thanks. So this research I did when I was a student at Lakehead University, and it came out of a conversation I had with Chris when I was living and working in Alaska. I was at the Institute of Social and Economic Research, UAA. Chris came up to talk about ReSDA, and we had a conversation about what my research interests are, and through that he offered to bring me on as a graduate student at Lakehead, and then I begun the 7-day journey from Anchorage to Thunder Bay, which was a really great experience. And some of the research that I did at ICER was related to indicators of well-being for children across the state of Alaska, and comparing that to indicators across the nation through the Kids Camp project. So I'm going to quickly run through some of this stuff because I don't have a lot of time, and just maybe. Okay, so my research question is kind of a two-part, is what are the similarities and differences of models of measuring community well-being in Alaska and Yukon, and what was the level of local input in the construction of these models? And one of my motivations for looking at this was I was asked to attend a meeting by the Anchorage Economic Development Corporation on their Live, Work, Play model of measuring well-being in the municipality of Anchorage, and had a lot of questions from that meeting that I was told that they weren't important and shouldn't be asked. And so from that I thought, well, I'm going to engage in that research for my graduate work, which I was able to do. So really, why are we interested in this notion of well-being? It's sort of, it's interesting to me. That research suggests that communities successful in establishing an agreed-upon model of measuring community well-being will benefit from local ownership of community affairs, such as greater decision-making, a larger capture of material wealth, and the empowerment over resource management, which I still know that that's what we're really interested in understanding. So my rationale for this is that my thesis highlights the needs to investigate models in the Arctic that address the clash between mainstream and indigenous measures of well-being, the lack of accurate and longitudinal data, remoteness, lack of infrastructure, as well as small population sizes. And the question I often get asked is why Alaska and why Yukon? I'm interested in the fact that they're right beside each other. You've got 4 levels of government sort of working together. U.S. federal government, Canadian federal government, state of Alaska, and Yukon territorial government. Just sort of to see how that can benefit or be a challenge for people in those areas. Also, I've lived in both Alaska and Yukon, and I'm kind of interested in what goes on in northern communities. I grew up in Fort McMurray. Sometimes I don't really admit that, but I think I'm safe here in this home. So what is this notion of well-being? This is one of the really interesting parts of my thesis for me, sitting and doing this research. It really has a long history, going all the way back to 4th century BC, but I'm going to skip that and just sort of fast forward a little bit to the latest 40 or 50 years. And what I found, which was really interesting, is that NASA was largely responsible for bringing attention to social indicators, is it really wanted to understand the impact the space program would have on society. And in 1969, the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare called for well-being to be included. Health is part of as well as illness. And in the 1970s, we know it was the social indicators movement that included both economic and non-economic indicators of well-being. And the WHO began work on medicalizing health and encouraging governments to consider a wider range of factors that contribute to poor health beyond disease or its absence. We saw the creation of the gross national happiness with the Canadian Baton, and I'd like to say that Australia has really been doing a lot of work on this notion of well-being and indicators of well-being, as well as really seeing that today that well-being is evolving to a point where it's conceptualized as a multi-dimensional construct rooted in those traditions back in the 4th century BC. Okay, so how did I define well-being? I define it as the combination of social, economic, environmental, cultural, and political conditions identified by individuals and their communities as essential for them to flourish and fulfill their potential. So, model of community well-being, I'm going to skip that and go to one that's actually been used. This is one that I've used as just a concept in my thesis. And sort of how did I go about this? It was a 3-step process in my methods. The first process of it was trying to understand the local level of input that was used in the construction of these models. And so I started out with literature review, pulling out keywords that I later used in content analysis, looked at publications such as newspapers, journals, blogs, etc., to see what was ever written or documented about the creation of these models, and then asked respondents about each of these models in the interviews that I did later on. The step 2 was this experimental content analysis, which was based on the literature review. I created a series of keywords related to community well-being, and there's quite a bit there that I could get into, but I'm going to save you from that and we'll go on for a little bit more of the fun stuff. So then I did a qualitative analysis of interviews, and I picked the greatest time of year to try to get people to sit down and have an interview, which is June. It's quite a challenge to get people to commit to an interview. But anyway, I ended up being able to conduct 8 of those. 6 were in Alaska and 2 were in Yukon. They're just semi-structured interviews. We spoke about this general idea of well-being, then asked about specific questions to the model that they were familiar with, and asked them more about their impressions of this idea of measuring well-being. And the sampling method was primarily snowball sampling, and they ended up knowing people that were involved in other things, transcribed and encoded those into a series of themes. This is the list of the models that I looked at, but I'll just quickly jump to this Live, Work, Play model by Economic Development Corporation. It has 39 indicators broken up into 3 different areas: live, work, and play. This has sort of gone back in time a little bit to 2013, where they've now done quite a bit more work on it, but this is what I looked at the time. So it's all quantitative measures, there's no qualitative, and what I did find out was there was very little consultation with the community of Anchorage. We're not so open to critique or questions by eager young researchers. Yeah, okay. I looked also here at the Yukon Government Social Inclusion and Poverty Reduction Strategy. It has 64 indicators within 15 sub-themes of both quantitative and qualitative, but I won't get into that just because of time. Health. Okay, quickly I'll get into, because I understand I probably have 15 more minutes left, right? The overall results, I'm not going to really blow anyone's hair back. It blew mine off. In what I found out throughout this process, overall community members really need to be included in all aspects of model design. If you don't, the model is not going to be accepted. You're really not going to see that community members own this or believe in it. Models really need to incorporate both objective and subjective indicators, and throughout this there's been a growing tension around the lack of direct action and funding to improve local living conditions. And if I can have 5 more seconds, just wanted to say that with my PhD research that I'm doing now, looking at community-based monitoring, and when we write up these results and these theses that everybody reads, we don't often see this sort of in play as to what we think is the right course of action. But to say I went to Fogo Island this year and had the opportunity to talk to a lot of community members out there, there's been a lot of work with developing models of community well-being on Fogo Island with the Shorefast Foundation. And really their trick was they asked a lot of people about what this meant, and the community really owns all of this, the work that's being done by the Shorefast Foundation. So it's really results in action is what I'm calling it. So, okay, anyway, that's all for me. Thank you very much.
Great. All right, and now the gentleman that stands between you and coffee, Mr. Todd Godfrey.
Hi, my name is Todd Godfrey. Really happy to be here, so thank you for the opportunity of letting me present at the conference. I'm a master's student at the University of Alberta. I'm studying agricultural and resource economics. Right now I'm working on a project for my thesis under the supervision of Drs. Bruno Richmond and Brenda Parlee, and in collaboration with the Inuit Valley Regional Corporation. So today I'm going to talk about indicators building tool for understanding community well-being. As you all know, the Arctic is undergoing significant change right now. Some of this is due to changing climate that's affecting the Arctic. Much is due to a growing global population and economy, which has led to an increased demand for resource development in the Arctic. This has had, as we've been talking about, some significant effects on all parts of individual lives in these communities. So there's a strong need for research on sustainable natural resource development in the Arctic. The department that I come from at the University of Alberta, economists are interested in doing research on many different areas. Many of these have to do with developing economies in the Arctic. Some are looking at sub-Saharan Africa and the struggling economies there due to geographical, institutional, and other challenges. While some are looking at the BRIC countries of Brazil, Russia, India, and China, which are fast-growing economic powers in today's world. So there's many different types of developing economies in the world. Some are large, and some are much smaller and struggling. There's many different types. Many Arctic communities can also be thought of as developing economies with their own set of challenges. However, much less economic research has been done for these Arctic areas in the north. So the objective of my research is to develop a framework for understanding relationships between economy and well-being. Simply put, my thesis is looking at these relationships for demographic groups all across Canada, but I'm including a focus on Arctic communities as well, looking at the Inuit Valley Settlement Region as a specific case study. This past summer, I had the opportunity to go to the Inuit Valley Settlement Region and work with the Inuit Valley Regional Corporation, people like Bob Simpson and Diane Archie. And I had a chance to talk to them quite a bit and really get an understanding of the socioeconomic conditions and challenges they're facing and things are important to them. So I know that the framework that we're developing in this research is very important to that region. When economists talk about economic development, they mean more than just economic growth. For development to occur, there needs to be an improvement in the quality of individual lives as well. An individual who's been very influential on this topic is Marcia Sen, his fitability approach, where basically he continues to talk about how increased output, more commodities consumed isn't really a very good measure for poverty and overcoming poverty, but we need to actually find ways to measure how does this affect individual standard of living. So you can have more production, but this will lead to greater environmental degradation. So one might have a positive effect on well-being, while the other has a negative effect. So we look at the net effect. So there's important things to consider in this type of framework. I know most of you are probably mostly familiar with the qualitative approach for your research. And the research I do is more quantitative research. I look at large data sets with thousands of respondents to examine these different attributes of well-being. Examples would be the large surveys that Statistics Canada does with tens of thousands of individuals in them. So why do I use large data sets? Well, it can be very useful to examine the big picture, to look and see what's happening in the larger population, or to compare what's happening between different groups, to compare different groups in the population. Probably most importantly, it gives evidence for how things are changing, how individuals' lives are changing, and with the data we can then actually measure these changes, measure the effects of individuals' lives, which lead to really helpful to affecting policies. Also, we're able to look at the relationships between many different socioeconomic indicators. Of course, there's limitations to this approach as there is any. The data might not contain enough detail, or it might be difficult just to get the data to show us what we need to see or what's happening in these areas. To measure well-being, I've broken it into three main components: health, education, and income or consumption. As you can see, these are considered very important, very vital parts of well-being by major organizations in the world. In the Nunavik settlement region, I was able to see the IRC that these are also very important to them. These are areas that they're focusing on in improving. And so this is what we're going to use for our framework. It happens to also be what the UN has used in the Human Development Index, which also measures well-being. So to build a framework we're going to use, we're going to pull data from large data sets on this information and then measure these components, these three components, and their determinants. There are three main sources of socioeconomic microdata available to examine economic development in the Arctic. The first are the Canadian Community Health Surveys. Together, they contain approximately 240,000 respondents for Canada-wide analysis. The second are the Aboriginal People Survey, which together contain approximately 10,000 respondents for Inuit and Nunavik. And the third is the Inuit Health Survey, which contains approximately 360 respondents available for the Inuit settlement region. Now, I'd like to note also that all three of these surveys do contain information and data available for the Arctic areas of Canada. There are many different ways and approaches we can take to develop this framework, and others we're still looking at, but currently we're developing a two-stage approach to look at this. In the first step, what I'm doing is I'm estimating separate equations for each of the components to well-being. There are many different socioeconomic indicators that affect each of these components to well-being. For health, we could have things like age, location, gender, or specifically availability of healthcare services. So what I've done for this model, just to kind of explain a little bit about it, I've broken the socioeconomic indicators into two groups. The first group contains all socioeconomic indicators that have an effect on all aspects of well-being. So examples of this would be things like age, gender, and location. The other group, I've grouped together all the socioeconomic indicators that affect the specific components to well-being, such as health, the availability of healthcare services. So that's what basically makes up the X's and Z's in these equations. And of course, we have to incorporate an error because we're looking at the mean of the population, and so there's individuals above and below that need to be incorporated in the model. The second step is we're going to take the estimates found from the first equations and put them into a model of life satisfaction. This is a variable that proxies for well-being. So you can see on the right-hand side of that equation, the variables there are the estimates found in the first three equations used. So all that socioeconomic information contained in those first equations comes right back down and is included in the life satisfaction model to measure general well-being. Now, I don't have results available yet. We're very early in the stage here. However, we'll be able to learn quite a few things from this framework. We'll be able to learn which socioeconomic indicators have an effect on each of these components to well-being, whether that's positive or negative. We'll also be able to see how these socioeconomic indicators have an effect on general well-being, whether that's positive or negative, and which channels these go through, whether it's health, education, or income. We'll also be able to measure these effects be able to implement policies, exact policies, on the areas that are most effective to improve well-being for these individuals. An example of how this could work is that we could use resource development as a socioeconomic indicator in this model. Now, this might have a positive impact on income, negative impact on health. So this framework will actually help us see what is the overall effect on well-being and how has this happened and how can we change this. Going forward, probably the most effective thing that can be done to do more of this kind of research is continued collection of more socioeconomic microdata. If we continue to do this, we'll be able to do further research on economic developments in the Arctic. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Todd. We're really now at the coffee break, so we haven't got a lot of time for discussion. But Chris has granted me 5 minutes to take questions. So what I ask is that the presenters come to the front, so you can have the mic if you're asked a question. Jeanette and Laura Jean. Okay, perfect. So we'll have a couple questions. Probably have room for 2 or 3. Any questions for any of the presenters? There's got to be 1 or 2. You're not getting out for coffee.
Very interesting presentation and a lot of good work you're doing here. I just had a few more questions about you showed this device and how you monitor the very stocks. I just want to know, are you doing this as a trip survey from the different actors? And can you talk a bit more about that tracking device, what it is and how you use it?
We're just new with trail marketing, so using that tracking device, we're learning about it more. We have 4? Yeah, we have 4. One is made for the winter because it's like really big and sturdy. It can go through -40. You know how cold it is in Alberta. Yes, it does track where you go. Yeah, what do you see? Like, they can take pictures or videos. Basically, it's for like any animal they see in their route. Like, they'll take pictures of mostly animals. We're still learning about it. But yeah.
And how many animals are for?
We usually have 4 monitors.
Good question, and Laura Jane and Jeanette can show you a little bit more about that because they have access to it's online. Okay, other questions?